in Bahrain with missiles and drones. There were 300 British personnel on the base, some within a few hundred yards of the strike. Last night, a drone hit RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus. There were no casualties in this strike. Mr. Speaker, it is important for me to say that our bases in Cyprus are not being used by US bombers. The security of our friends and partners in Cyprus is of critical importance. And, Mr. Speaker, I want to be clear. The strike on RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus was not in response to any decision that we have taken. In our assessment, the drone was launched prior to our announcement. Iran's aggression towards Britain and our interests is long-standing, and that's why we've always ensured that protections for British bases and personnel are at their highest level. Mr. Speaker, it is very clear that the death of the Supreme Leader will not stop Iran from launching these strikes. In fact, their approach is becoming even more reckless and more dangerous to civilians. They are working ruthlessly and deliberately through a plan to strike not only military targets, but also economic targets in the region, with no regard for civilian casualties. That is the situation we face today, and to which we must respond. Mr. Speaker, I've been speaking to our Gulf partners over the weekend. They're outraged by Iran's acts, particularly as they played no part in any strikes, and they've asked us to do more to defend them. Moreover, it is my duty, the highest duty of my office, to protect British lives. That is why we put British jets in the air, Typhoons and F-35s, as part of coordinated defensive operations, which have already successfully intercepted Iranian strikes, including, Mr. Speaker, taking out one drone that was heading towards a coalition base in Iraq, housing UK service personnel. I want to pay tribute to our brilliant servicemen and women, putting themselves in harm's way to keep others safe. And I know the whole House will join me in expressing our gratitude and our respect. But, Mr. Speaker, it is simply not possible to shoot down every Iranian missile and every drone after they've been launched. The only way to stop the threat is to destroy the missiles at source, in their storage depots or at the launchers. The US requested permission to use British bases for that specific and limited defensive purpose, because they have the capabilities to do so. Yesterday evening, we took the decision to accept that new request in order to prevent Iran firing missiles across the region, killing innocent civilians, putting British lives at risk, and hitting countries that have not been involved. To be clear, the use of British bases is limited to the agreed defensive purposes. We are not joining the US and Israeli offensive strikes. The basis for our decision is the collective self-defence of long-standing friends and allies and protecting British lives. It is in accordance with international law, and we've produced a summary of our legal advice which clearly sets this out. We will keep the decision under review. Mr. Speaker, we are not joining the strikes, but we will continue our defensive actions in the region. France and Germany are also prepared to enable US action to destroy Iran's capability to fire missiles and drones from source. I've been in close contact with President Macron and Chancellor Merz in recent days, as well as President Trump and leaders across the region to that end. Mr. Speaker, be in no doubt, the regime in Iran is utterly abhorrent. In January, they murdered thousands of their own people, the full horror of which is still hidden from the world. For decades, they have sought to destabilise the region and export terror around the world. Their proxies in Yemen have targeted British ships in the Red Sea. They facilitated Russia's attacks in Ukraine. The regime's tentacles have even reached these shores, posing a direct threat to Iranian dissidents and to the Jewish community. Over the last year alone, Iran has backed more than 20 potentially lethal attacks on UK soil, each of which, Mr. Speaker, we have foiled. So it's clear the Iranian regime must never be allowed to get their hands on nuclear weapons. That remains the primary aim of the United Kingdom and our allies, including the US, and ultimately this will have to be achieved at the negotiating table. Mr. Speaker, in this dangerous moment, our first thoughts are with our citizens in the region, friends, family members and constituents. I recognise the deep concern that the situation is causing for those involved and for communities across the country. We're asking all British citizens in the region to register their presence so we can provide the best possible support, and to monitor the Home Office travel advice, which is being regularly updated. Across much of the region, airspace remains closed, and local authorities are advising individuals to shelter in place. The situation on the ground may remain challenging for some time, so we're sending rapid deployment teams to the region to support our British nationals on the ground. And we're in close contact with the travel industry and governments in the region, including with our friends in the UAE, given the concentration of British nationals in that country. And we're looking at all options to support our people. We want to ensure that they can return home as swiftly and safely as possible. The FCDO phone lines are open to provide consular support, and ministers are available to meet MPs to discuss any individual cases. Mr. Speaker, we're also reaching out to communities across the United Kingdom, including Muslim and Jewish community organisations, and we're making sure that sites across the country, including places of worship, have appropriate protective security in place. Mr. Speaker, the situation in the region is developing rapidly, so we will continue to update the House in coming days. Mr. Speaker, I've spoken recently about the toll that global events are taking here at home. They come crashing into our lives with ever greater frequency, hitting our economy, driving up prices on the supermarket shelves or at the pump, dividing communities, bringing anxiety and fear. That's why how we operate on the world stage matters so much. Mr. Speaker, we all remember the mistakes of Iraq, and we have learned those lessons. Any UK actions must always have a lawful basis and a viable, thought-through plan. I say again, we were not involved in the initial strikes on Iran, and we will not join offensive action now. But in the face of Iran's barrage of missiles and drones, we will protect our people in the region and support the collective self-defence of our allies, because that is our duty to the British people. It is the best way to eliminate the urgent threat, to prevent the situation spiralling further, and support a return to diplomacy. It is the best way to protect British interests and British lives. That is what this government is doing, and I commend this statement to the House.
Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Bednall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement and for the security briefing I received earlier. This is a defining moment for the people of Iran, the wider Middle East and the world order. I know that hundreds of thousands of British people still in the region, many sheltering from drone attacks, are fearful about making it home. I agree with the Prime Minister that everyone in the region should follow FCDO advice and register their presence with the British Embassy. Can the Prime Minister confirm whether he is making contingency plans for a potential evacuation of UK citizens and what stage the operational planning is at? Let me also, Mr. Speaker, pay tribute to our brave service personnel stationed in British bases in the region. I know that this will be an anxious time for them and their families. They all have our support. Mr. Speaker, we stand in solidarity with our allies, including Bahrain, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, who, along with others, have been on the receiving end of unprovoked aggression. On Saturday, our allies, the United States and Israel, took targeted action against the Iranian regime, a regime which for decades has been brutally repressing its own citizens, whose leader had the blood of hundreds of thousands of Iranians on his hands and of countless others around the world killed by Iranian proxies. This regime is the world's foremost sponsor of international terrorism. It seeks to annihilate the world's only Jewish state. It has said so repeatedly, and we should take despots at their word. It is a regime whose apparatchiks chant death to Britain. It has attacked British nationals and conducted multiple plots on British soil, as the head of MI5 has warned. It is manufacturing drones en masse for Russia, drones which are raining down on innocent Ukrainians. And it continues to try to develop nuclear weapons in flagrant violation of international agreement, nuclear weapons which, if obtained, would be an existential threat for this country. The outcome of Ayatollah Khamenei's death will, we hope, be a safer Middle East and a safer world, with the future of Iran back in the hands of the Iranian people. But that outcome is not yet guaranteed. On Saturday, our allies in Canada and Australia immediately backed the action taken by America against this despotic regime in Tehran. And I have made it very clear that the Conservative Party also stands behind America taking this necessary action against state-sponsored terror. But over the weekend, statements from the government and the Prime Minister provided no such clarity. It was only last night that the Prime Minister finally told us that the government would allow our allies the use of our own air bases, despite it being obvious that UK interests were under imminent threat. It took Iranian missiles hitting allies in the Gulf before he finally made a decision. And even after that, the Foreign Secretary said this morning that the government has put limits on the actions of our allies operating from our bases. Unbelievably, in his statement today, the Prime Minister still cannot say whether he backs the strikes or not. Today, the President of the United States has taken the extraordinary step of rebuking the Prime Minister publicly, saying he took far too long to grant access. We are told that this dither and delay is because of concerns over international law, but I am afraid that explanation simply does not hold. International law didn't prevent our allies from clearly and unequivocally stating whose side they were on. You don't need international law to say whose side you're on. It has not prevented British governments in the past from supporting strikes which we knew to be right. As the Shadow Attorney General has said, if the doctrines of international law are unable to restrain Iranian terrorism and mass murder, if they tie the hands of democracies while forcing us to stand and watch Iranian atrocities, international law will have failed. It will have become a fundamentally immoral system of law. Why is it that under this Prime Minister, international law always seems to be at odds with our national interest? Why is it that we are giving away? Why is it that we are giving away the Chagos Islands and paying £35 billion for the privilege, rather than standing up for our national interest and protecting the crucial military base, which even now our allies are using? We in this House are elected to stand up for Britain's national interest, and where the government is doing the right thing, we will always back them. So let me reiterate our offer that if the government brings forward legislation to fast-track banning the IRGC, we will support them. But let me ask the Prime Minister, what national interest was served by refusing to help our allies for so long, particularly when we so need American support to protect Ukraine's and Europe's security? Are we going to see new UK military capabilities deployed to protect our security partners, our bases, including in Cyprus, and British nationals in the region? And will the Prime Minister ensure the Chancellor uses the Spring Statement tomorrow to set Britain on a clear path to 3% of GDP on defence spending? There is no point wanting action to make the world a safer place, but being too scared to do anything except stand by and watch others. Mr. Speaker, our national interest and national security must be front and centre. The Conservative Party will always work with our allies to make the world a safer place.
Mr. Speaker, she asked about contingency plans for UK nationals, and I can assure her and the House we're working at speed with our partners in the region to take whatever measures we can to make sure that our people can return as safely and as swiftly as possible, and will continue to do so. And I'm happy to update her and the House as we roll out those plans. Mr. Speaker, let me be very clear. There were two distinct and separate decisions over the weekend. The first decision was whether or not the United Kingdom should join the U.S. Israel offensive against Iran. We took the decision that we should not. That we should not.
Absolutely right.
The second decision was a separate decision, and actually a separate request from the US, which was whether we should permit the use of bases for the distinct, specific, defensive purpose of collective self-defence of our allies and to protect British lives, which were put at risk by the actions of Iran on Saturday and Sunday. We took the decision that we should do so. I am clear in my mind that any UK action must always have a lawful basis. It must also always have a viable and thought-through plan.
Yes.
And it must be in our national interest.
Yes.
The Leader of the Opposition, I think, is saying she would have joined the initial strikes whether they were lawful or not. I noticed she didn't say the Shadow Attorney General said they would have been lawful, just that the law should be changed.
Yes.
And I think she said they would have joined the initial strikes without regard to whether they had a plan. She was very critical of us not joining sooner. Therefore, it's impossible to have that position without arguing that we should and we could have joined. I fundamentally disagree. Mr. Speaker, I will tell the House why. Where our military personnel take action, putting their lives at risk, it is our duty, my duty, to ensure they have a lawful basis. On Saturday, we deployed UK pilots into the sky in the region, and they've been working there ever since. They deserve to know that their actions are lawful and there is a viable, thought-through plan. And I will not countenance committing our military personnel to action which doesn't have a lawful basis. That is not a fair thing to do to our serving personnel. And no UK Prime Minister has ever committed our personnel to action unless it's got a proper lawful basis.
In the Select Committee, Dame Emily Thornbury.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Although the attack on Iran by the US and Israel was ill-advised, ill-judged and illegal, it is absolutely no excuse for the Iranians to recklessly bombard its Gulf neighbours. I'd like to ask the Prime Minister, is he in a position to give us more details on what we're doing with our Ukrainian friends to support the collective self-defence of Arab nations against the Iranian Shahid drones that are causing so much damage in Ukraine and now in the Gulf?
Can I thank her for that question, because it is an important question. Ukraine, sadly, has more expertise than anyone in dealing with drones, and that's why we're putting their expertise and our expertise together and using it to help our allies in the region as they struggle with drones as we speak.
Sir Ed David, Leader of the Liberal Democrats.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement for my security briefing. Once again, President Trump has launched a unilateral and unlawful act. Ayatollah Khamenei was a brutal dictator and a monstrous war criminal. He supported Hamas and their October the 7th atrocities, and he massacred thousands of his own people for daring to protest against decades of repression. I shed no tears for him. But instead I think of all the innocent Iranian civilians who have lost their lives. I think of the U.S. service personnel killed in action, our allies and partners in the region who are being outrageously targeted by Iran, and our British bases which have already faced attack. They did not choose this war. Donald Trump did, and he will bear responsibility for it. We have seen before what happens when an American president launches an illegal war with no idea how or when it is going to end, and we fear for what comes next. So in discussions with the White House, has the Prime Minister demanded to find out what Trump's plan is for what comes next? Does the Prime Minister understand that when he fails to stand up to Trump, especially when he breaks international law, it makes our country less safe? And how will the Prime Minister be sure that defensive operations from UK bases will not become offensive? And in rightly protecting our allies in the region, can we be assured by the Prime Minister that he won't follow Trump's lead down a slippery slope into a protracted conflict? And finally, Mr. Speaker, we rightly expect our brave armed forces to protect British citizens around the world in crises like this. But that includes tax exiles like Isabel Oakeshott and washed-up old footballers who mock ordinary people who stay in the UK and pay our taxes here. So as we protect them, does the Prime Minister agree it is only right for tax exiles to start paying taxes to fund our armed forces just like the rest of us do?
Well, can I thank you for his question and agree that the response of Iran has been outrageous, particularly hitting countries which played no part in the strikes on them. We have had extensive discussions with the United States at all levels, including the military-to-military level, continually over the course of the weekend. We deliberately took the decision not to join the offensive strikes that were carried out by the US and Israel. We did take the decision to take defensive action, firstly ourselves on Saturday with putting pilots in the sky, and secondly by allowing the bases to be used for purely defensive reasons. And we clearly set out the legal basis upon which we took the second of those decisions. And in relation to the limits, they are limited to defence, and that is the base upon which we've agreed the basing. In relation to his last point, I want to be clear that it is my duty, our duty, to protect all UK nationals in the region, and we will endeavour to do everything we can in order to do so.
Chair of the Defence Select Committee, Tammanji Singh Desai.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Iranian regime, including its late leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, are of course no friends of our country, but I thank the Prime Minister for clarifying that the UK had no involvement in the Israeli and US strikes on Iran. And indeed, my heartfelt condolences to all those who have sadly lost loved ones in the region thus far. And I'm extremely concerned about the safety of the millions of people in the region, including the thousands of Brits who are living there and currently stranded there. So can the Prime Minister please confirm What steps are being taken to ensure their safety, especially from the one-way attack drones? What steps are being taken to help evacuate those Brits who are stranded and want to come back to the UK? And what steps are being taken with our allies to help de-escalate the situation?
In relation to the protection of our citizens, obviously we're still operating and we will continue operating defensively in the air in the region, taking out the missiles and the drones and the strikes, and we have permitted the US basing specifically for the purpose of taking out Iran's ability to launch the strikes in the first place, and the US has the capability to do that in particular. On the question of our citizens and their desire, understandably, to return home as swiftly and safely as possible, we're doing all that we can, working very closely with our partners in the region, and I would ask all those in the region to register their presence so we can give them the best advice as quickly as possible as to how we can keep them safe and bring them home as quickly as possible.
Father of the House, Sir Edward Lee.
Well, whilst many of us believe that we should be guided by the law of national self-interest, not so-called international law, does the Prime Minister agree that we are right to be cautious in this matter, that the British public will warmly support him in defending British people and bases, but they're very sceptical about being dragged into the cesspit of Middle East politics? They remember Iraq, which some of us voted against. They remember all the arguments about weapons of mass destruction. What evidence, actually, is there that Iran was on the cusp of acquiring nuclear weapons? And since when has regime change from the skies ever changed the regime?
Let me thank him for his question. This government does not believe in regime change from the skies, and I thank him for his question. The lessons of history have taught us that it is important when we make decisions like this that we establish there is a lawful basis for what the United Kingdom is doing. That is one of the lessons from Iraq. And that there's a viable, thought-through plan with an objective that can be achieved or has a viable prospect of being achieved. That is the principles that I applied to the decisions that I made over the weekend. They're the principles I applied to the decision not to get involved in the offensive strikes of the US and Israel. They're also the principles I applied separately to the separate decision and a separate request from the US to be able to take defensive action in order to hit the launchers for the missiles that are currently going into allies, countries in the region, and currently threatening our citizens and our service personnel. And I stand by both of those decisions. I repeat, I am not prepared to commit our military service people to action unless I am sure that what they're doing is lawful and has a viable basis. We can discuss what the law is on another occasion, but the law is what it is, and they deserve to know that their Prime Minister cares and pays attention to whether what I'm asking them to do is lawful, and I will always do that.
Diane Abbott, Mother of the House.
The Prime Minister will be aware that very many of our constituents remember the Iraq War. And they will have noted the similarities between this war and the Iraq War, both in the Middle East and both illegal. Of course, this regime, the current regime in Iran, is a horrible regime, violent, murderous, and a threat to international order. But does he accept that our constituents are not prepared to see this country dragged into another war, even in the nature of the Iraq War?
Can I thank her and assure her that we do need and have learnt the lessons of Iraq, which is why I've been so clear there must be a lawful basis and a viable, thought-through plan. In relation to our nationals, I think everybody and all of our constituents would expect our government to take action to protect British nationals. We have 300 British nationals in the region. They are at risk. We've already seen strikes on hotels and airport hotels where our British nationals have been staying. We've had strikes near military bases within hundreds of yards of our personnel. It's our duty to take the action that we can take and will take to protect them.
Sir Oliver Dowden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that the Prime Minister has outlined that the Iranians attacked a United Kingdom sovereign base at Akrotiri, why does that not form the basis for legal military action against the Iranians, not just hosting US forces on our bases, but taking direct action at source against the launch of such missiles, as we did in relation to the Iranian proxies, the Houthis, in previous conflicts that he supported? Moreover, given the Iranians' ability to exercise malign influence on the streets of this country, what reassurances can he give the House and the public at large about coordination across our intelligence and security capabilities to address this heightened threat on our streets?
In relation to the second point, can I tell him there is coordination going on for that very reason? As I set out in my statement, there have been 20 Iranian-backed plots to take action on our streets, all of which have been thwarted, and I pay my respect to our security and intelligence services in the work that they do. In relation to the point he makes, there were two separate decisions made over the weekend. We are in the sky taking action defensively on our allies. Among the reasons we agreed to the request from the US yesterday is because they have the capability to take the missile launchers out in Iran, and that is why we gave them the permission to use our bases in order to reduce the threat to our citizens.
Thank
you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has spoken about possibly repatriating British citizens in the region. Can he tell us whether this will be through the MOD, and if so, who will foot the bill? Will it be the MOD, the Treasury, or those who are being repatriated?
We're working across all departments in relation to repatriation, and at the moment we're simply focused on working with our allies to get a plan together to get people out in the first place and to do it as quickly, safely as possible, and there's no intention to charge people for that.
Sir Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister's reaction at the end of last week appeared to many to be both anemic and disappointing, and at variance with the other Five Eye nations. Yeah. Will he read the analysis of the shadow attorney, the noble and learned KC Lord Wolfson, which shows not only that British active engagement and support is within international law, but that those who seek to use international law to constrain us in these circumstances have the effect of leaving tyrants and murderers in place to continue perpetrating their vile deeds with impunity? Excellent.
Mr. Speaker, we obviously coordinate with our Five Eyes partners. We were dealing with a specific request to take action, and that was important that we applied the principles that actually have been applied by successive governments, which is to ask the question and get legal advice on the question: is there a lawful basis for what is proposed, and does it have a viable, thought-through plan? It's not a legal question. It's about exposing our military personnel to action that risks their lives, making sure that it is lawful before we ask them to do that. I think that is the duty of the Prime Ministers, and previous Prime Ministers have taken exactly the same approach. I will, of course, read the Shadow Attorney's advice, but I'm very clear in the advice that I received, and I will not commit our military personnel to unlawful action. That is not what they would expect and deserve. They are entitled to better than that.
Donald.
As others have mentioned, from Iraq to Afghanistan to Libya, I think many of us know the way this goes. And there are responsibilities on all of our shoulders. And the Prime Minister is right, there needs to be a plan. Has the US President shared with him or consulted with him on what the plan is? Because from our experience we know it's easy for politicians to start the war and fire the weapons. It's when the shooting ends, the nightmare begins.
Yes, exactly.
That's why we need clarity of our role as a country, an independent country, not necessarily swayed even by Donald Trump. And can I say to him, when he stood for the leadership of the Labour Party, he very clearly set out that there would be a vote in this House on any decision about military action. Can I ask him to assure us, so that we don't drift into this war as we have in the past, that there will be a vote in this House?
Well, can I thank him? And he's right to urge caution. History teaches us that. And that is why it's important not only that there's a lawful basis, but there is a plan that is viable and thought through. And obviously, we've had discussions at all levels with the US in relation to that. In relation to the decision I took yesterday, I'm very clear what the lawful basis is and what the plan in relation to the protection of our nationals is. On the question he raises about a vote, that is, of course, a vote on offensive action, deploying our troops or military, and that is not this situation.
Carmike.
You will recall that in 2003, this House voted to support George Bush's war in Iraq, and that 10 years later then we voted against supporting Barack Obama's intervention in Syria. I believed and still believe that on both occasions we made the wrong decision, but it was of critical importance for the political and even the social cohesion of this country that these should be decisions made in this chamber. Mr. Speaker, the people of the United Kingdom will not support an intervention that does not have a clear objective and a clear plan for post-conflict period. Will the Prime Minister be guided by these principles, and will he ensure that this House is given its place in whatever is handed to us in the weeks and months to come?
Well, of course, this House must hold accountability and debate on this issue. But just in relation to the vote, there is no convention for a vote in relation to defensive action, only offensive action. And nor could there be, realistically. Defensive action has to be taken at very swift notice. On Saturday morning, I had to take the decision to deploy our pilots to the sky in order to defend our UK nationals. There is no way we could have waited for a debate or vote in the House. Equally, last night I had to take a decision about the deployment and use of bases, and to do that when it was important to do it as a matter of some urgency. But I agree with him, there must be a full debate in the House, but actually the vote in the House is in relation to deployment of military personnel for offensive action, and that is something I have advocated.
Abtisam Mohammed.
Mr. Speaker, I have constituents and family in the region, all terrified about what may come next. The world is infinitely a more dangerous place today than it was last week. Trump and Netanyahu chose to throw away diplomacy and launch a direct attack on Iran, an attack which, as the Prime Minister has said, can never be justified under international law. Equally, Iran's indiscriminate attacks on airports and hotels across the Gulf are also flagrant violations of sovereignty and clear breaches of international law. Does the Prime Minister recognise that this regime change attempt, like so many others before it, will only result in years of instability and conflict in the region? And what assurances can the Prime Minister give that the UK's involvement will remain in defence and will not turn into full-scale military involvement as we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya?
Can I thank her for her question and be absolutely clear about the basis upon which the request was acceded to yesterday? It was the collective self-defence of our allies and the protection of British nationals. That remains the case. If it changes, I'll of course make a different decision and inform the House, and therefore she can rest assured that that's the basis of the action that we've taken and will remain the basis of the action that we've taken.
Sir Jeremy Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. British influence in the Middle East is directly linked to the strength of our military and our willingness to use it. When he took office, the Prime Minister rightly increased defence spending, but that sum is now widely thought to be too little and taking too long. So will he unlock the argument between the Treasury and the Ministry of Defence so that this House can always have confidence that we will maintain a military formidable enough to defend our borders, our interests and our values?
Yes, we're working at speed on that, and it's an important point, and it's important that we do so. I would remind the party opposite that they hollowed out our armed forces. It was this government that increased defence spending in the course of this Parliament.
Rogan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Over the weekend, I passed through Dubai Airport, and along with thousands of other people and many of my own constituents, as it turns out, boarded a flight home. Shortly after leaving, we heard the news that this attack had happened. And my immediate thoughts went to the people that were still in the airport, that were then grounded and stuck there, not knowing where to turn or what was going to happen. Now, rather than the blatant aggression and angry sneers that we're seeing from some of the opposition, would the Prime Minister agree that what we need in this situation is calmness and a clear and strategic plan? That is what our constituents want.
Can I thank, and I'm sure that's what our constituents do want. Can I also say how concerned I think we all are across the House at the attacks on hotels and airports in particular. These are hotels that British nationals and others are using, and airports, of course, that civilians are using. This is the extent of the strikes by Iran and the reckless disregard for civilian life that comes with the targets they're working through.
Sir Olney.
The people of Iran have suffered decades of atrocities under the rule of an oppressive regime. However, as we've seen from Iraq and from Libya, the removal of an evil head of state without a future plan for governance can lead to countries becoming failed states. So while I welcome the Prime Minister's reluctance to involve the UK in another protracted war in the Middle East, I remain unclear on the government's vision for the region. I'd like to ask the Prime Minister, does he want regime change? Have his officials contacted the leading opposition figures, such as Reza Pahlavi, to arrange such contingency plans? Or does he wish to negotiate a diplomatic solution with the current regime?
Mr Speaker, the immediate plan is obviously to take the necessary measures to protect our nationals. And look, no, I don't think anybody mourns the death of the Supreme Leader. I firmly believe that ultimately the only way forward is a negotiated outcome. Whatever the conflict going on, in the end it will have to end in a negotiated outcome. And that has been the consistent position of both parties for a considerable period of time.
Polly Billington.
We have rightly been focused on defending and protecting British citizens in the region. Can the Prime Minister confirm, though, that he believes